Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Rod Dreher. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Have you heard of re-enchantment? It's a buzzword that is increasingly common in traditionalist Christian circles, among Catholics, among the Orthodox, and even some Protestants. It's a word that describes the supernatural appearing in a high-tech world that sought to undermine the supernatural, that worships rationalism. Sometimes this re-enchantment is light, and sometimes it's dark. Conservative intellectuals everywhere from the New York Times to Substack are reckoning with re-enchantment, and in ways that go beyond religion, right to the heart of our politics. Sure, there appears to be a resurgence of what some would call pagan spirituality, from astrology and the tarot boom to covens of witches casting spells on Donald Trump or practicing so-called white magic. But this is creeping into culture in some very big and very political ways. This week, for instance, lawmakers held a massive hearing on UFOs, a popular concern among some of these traditionalist Christian thinkers. Generative AI is another space, and more broadly, some of the most influential people on the right, from J.D. Vance on down to think tanks and journalists, are currently reconsidering and deepening their faiths by viewing the world through this lens. So let's get to the bottom of this, because it really is an influential strain of thought on the right. Today's guest, Rod Dreher of the Danube Institute, literally wrote the book about Christian re-enchantment. He helped introduce his friend J.D. Vance to politics and writes about the intersection of politics, culture, and faith every day on Substack at Rod Dreher's Diary. His fascinating new book is called Living in Wonder, Finding Mystery and Meaning in a Secular Age. Rod joins us now. Rod Dreher, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Maybe a good place to start is just if you could define, and you do this in the book, but for people who aren't familiar with the concept of re-enchantment, could you maybe walk us through a little bit of what that means as you see it?
Sure. Well, I hate the word enchantment because it makes people think about sprinkling fairy dust on the world, turning everything into Disneyland. That's not it. I use the word enchantment more like Max Weber meant when he said the modern world was disenchanted, meaning that people don't feel the presence of the spirit, things spiritual around them, God or anything else. We've built so many, to use Charles Taylor's language, we built so many buffers between ourselves and unmediated experience that we've sort of, made it where we can't perceive what is actually there. So when I talk about re-enchantment, I mean that ways we can learn how to see what's really there, how to feel and perceive the things of the spirit, and also to believe, really believe that there is ultimate meaning in the world, not just meaning that we project onto it, but that meaning exists outside of us and that we can exist in relationship to it, we can participate in it. But it's not the sort of thing where we conceptualize it in our head and then project that back out onto the world like a film projector, but we're actually living in some sort of mysterious communion with it.
And that mysterious communion probably feels most acute to the modern person when they are thinking about or reading about in the book, which I can't recommend enough, experiences people have with, let's say, UAPs or UFOs. Congress is literally, as we speak, holding a hearing into UAPs, or AI, generative AI, which there's a description in the book of that as a, quote, high-tech Ouija board. There's obviously been a boost or a surge in astrology again, and these are some really obvious areas where people may feel that communion with the ultimate mystery. Could you talk to us, Rod, a little bit about what it means in that kind of practical sense? Where is re-enchantment appearing in the modern person's life in those sort of obvious domains and maybe in others as well?
Well, one of the most important things that happened to me as I was researching this book is when a 27-year-old Anglican seminarian approached me in Oxford at a conference during the break and said, listen, there's something you need to know as someone of Generation X, which is that the new atheism is not the threat to Christianity now. The threat is from the occult. And what he meant was that his generation, millennials, Gen Z, they're not interested in atheism. They're interested in having some contact, experience with the numinous, the transcendent, the mysterious. But they don't think they can get it in the conventional churches, or perhaps they don't want it that way because to be enchanted as a Christian means that you have to take on a certain number of a moral framework that you may not wish to, that would bind your freedom. Well, so this is why you're seeing so many people get interested in UFOs. You see them getting interested in the occult, because they want, and psychedelics too, by the way, they want these experiences without having to pay for them in some way. Uh, when I talk about psychedelics as something that is in my past. Before I became a Christian in college, I tried psychedelics, and they work. They really do give you that experience. Now, it can be counterfeit, or it could be really dangerous. You could be opening up doors that you shouldn't open up. But I felt that I had to talk about it. I had to admit that I had done psychedelics, because if I'm going to tell people, don't do this, I need to let them know I tried it and it does have real power, but it's not power that we should seek. But yeah, people are reaching out through astrology, and even through, of all things, all the way to Satanism. This young Anglican seminarian who approached me, and I quote him in the book, he said that there were even two Satanists in his office in London before he went to seminary, who defined Satanism as learning how to be your most fully human self. And you consecrate total selfishness and total desire. And you also, if you're a ritual Satanist, you put in, the weird woo there. All of these things are appearing now because you can't keep them walled off forever. There's a guy down at Rice University, Jeffrey Kripal, who is a scholar who's been studying this for all of his career. And in his written work for the past 10 years at least, he's talked about how eventually the iron cage of rationality that we put around the experience of life is going to have to give way, because weird things just keep happening, and people will finally stop trying to explain it away and just go with it.
On that note, so if we stick in psychedelics as an example, what you're saying is that, the people who would ultimately explain the psychedelic experience, the power that those drugs can have as material, they would say, here's scientific reason X, Y, Z, why it does this to the brain and this to the body, that ultimately those material explanations stop short of actually describing what really happens to somebody. And what's interesting about that is it seems like Yuval Noah Harari, as you write about in the book, he's increasingly talking about the organism as the algorithm and all of that. This is essentially saying, your take on this is essentially saying, that's incorrect. Our knowledge has a limit. It hits a ceiling at a certain point, and then there's mystery at the heart of some of these phenomenon.
That's true. I mean, I go back in the book, I talk about the long path to disenchantment in the modern world. And it starts, as I see it, with nominalism, which is something that most people have never heard of, but it is a philosophical and theological development in the High Middle Ages, in which that was the break in which the West stopped believing that reality, or that truth was embedded in the material world, in the logos, and it began to think that God was separate in some real metaphysical sense from the material world. Now, that all sounds like angels dancing on the head of a pin, but what it ultimately did, as this idea played out over the coming centuries, is it ended up evacuating God from the material world. Now, as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, I believe that matter and spirit interpenetrate in some mysterious way. And the Catholic Church actually teaches that too, but you don't hear a lot about it these days. We are so caught up in the modern world in Cartesian mind-body dualism, the idea that everything outside the mind is dead matter, and that if we have these numinous mystical experiences, it must in some sense have been generated by our mind, and it's just an illusion. I say, no, that's not true at all. And in fact, I talk in the book about the whole weird phenomenon.
I was just going
to Western educate. Yeah. Well, that's Joe Henrich at Harvard came up with this concept of people who are Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. People who grow up in those societies, and that's all of us in the West, have dramatically different psychological orientations from people all over the rest of the world. We are much more closed to the numinous, to the spiritual, to the transcendent, because of the way we were psychologically formed. And I think that's actually good news in a way, because it tells people who are despairing within our culture, despairing that there is ultimate meaning, that there is mystery. But no. This is just a take. And it's a take that only a small number of people in the world have. And in fact, everyone in the West prior to the early modern period also had the take of the people elsewhere in the world. That there is so much more going on in reality than we know. We have lied to ourselves, or rather allowed ourselves to accept the lie that the only thing that is real is what can be known scientifically and what is materialist.
And this is a recurring theme in the book where you're saying, and I agree, of course, I think it's accurate, that we're weird. But the culture is saying, as Christ said it would, that you're weird, Rod, that this book is weird, that this book is just chock full of, lunacy, because the year is 2024, and we all know that demons are a figment of the imagination that can be explained with all of these various sort of material descriptions of science. Is COVID the accelerant that sort of has this all take off in culture? I mean, I feel like that's when I started to see more and more, but your book also has a lot of stories that predate COVID significantly, anecdotes that you've collected from various living people. What's happening right now, Rod? What poured the gasoline on the fire?
Well, I think COVID is actually as good an explanation as any. We started seeing in my old church when I was living in Louisiana during COVID, we started seeing a real influx of people, usually evangelicals for whatever reason, coming into the Orthodox Church. I'm Eastern Orthodox, looking for something that they said was deeper and more solid, and I think gave them a sense of connection with the transcendent. Because COVID scared them. It made them realize that the world was actually a lot more uncontrollable than they had thought. And they were frightened out of the sort of middle class, therapeutic experience of religion, and they wanted something more transcendent. But I think, too, that just the acceleration of the culture itself after 9/11, with everything that happened, with the economic crash of 2008, with the arrival of the Great Awakening and so on and so forth, the election of Trump, it just made the culture seem to be going faster and faster, more and more out of control. And people began to suspect, even if they couldn't admit it to themselves, that there has to be more to this, that the world can't be something that we can put in a rational box.
There are people who say they have these experiences with the paranormal as somebody passes away. For example, they didn't realize the person passed away. They had an apparition that seemed, indistinguishable from a normal human being. Visit them. They later found out the person had died. These are just some examples, but there are people who find them very comforting. And the reason I give that example is just because it gets to this question of distinguishing dark enchantment from holy enchantment. And to the layperson who's listening to this, Rod, and maybe the secular person who's listening to this, and yearning for something more, or just saying, like, these guys are crazy, what is the way to distinguish holy from dark enchantment?
Well, I say at the beginning of the book that this is not a book about re-enchantment per se, but about Christian re-enchantment, because my own commitments are Christian. I believe that the truth is in Christianity, the fullness of truth. It's not to say that there isn't truth else in other religions, but the fullness of truth is in Christianity. So I could not accept as genuine enchantment any form of enchantment that appeared outside of Christian bounds. Or even if it did, I would have to accept it or understand it in Christian terms. And that means that some of the things you hear people going through that occur in, say, pagan ceremonies, witchcraft, Santeria, that sort of thing, I would say, yeah, that is real. It's not fake, but it's not of God. I feel that if you don't ground yourself in an authoritative Christian tradition, whether it's Protestant, Orthodox, or Catholic, something authoritative and grounded in the Word of God, then you get yourself in real trouble. And it's better to refuse these experiences if you can't be absolutely certain that it was something of God. Better to refuse them than to accept them.
It's actually really an interesting, I'm just thinking about this now, I'm sure you've thought about this a lot, but your last three books, correct me if I'm wrong, were Benedict Option, Live Not by Lies, and now Living in Wonder. And in a way, I mean, that's a puzzle that fits together really naturally. Benedict Option, you've written about this fairly recently. Post-COVID, it must feel very vindicating for you, as other people are. You also have, you're dealing with the kind of Doug Wilson tract and your tract, and there's all kinds of debate about it. But before, there are people who weren't even open to the debate that you started with Benedict Option.
That's right. When Benedict Option came out in 2017, there were some people who said, and this drives me crazy because it still happens 7 years later. They say, well, you're saying we have to head for the hills, and I'm not for that. No, I'm not. Read the book. I say that there's nowhere to escape to. But if we, in this post-Christian world, if we are going to be faithful, live faithfully as Christians, then we're going to have to step back somewhat from the world, deepen our spiritual disciplines, deepen our sense of community, and deepen our commitments to our families so that when we face the world, we can face the world as Christ would have us do. That's what the Benedict Option is about. But people thought I was being alarmist. Only 3 years go by, or 3 or 4 years, and we get to the summer of George Floyd and COVID, and suddenly people were writing me saying, oh, you saw it coming, you saw it coming. I wasn't any kind of prophet. I could just read the deeper currents of our culture. And same with Live Not by Lies. That book sold really, really well. It's by far my bestseller, even though it had the least press coverage of just about anything I've written, because it was word of mouth. It came out 6 months into COVID and 2 months after the summer of George Floyd. And it gave people a way to understand the soft totalitarianism that they saw all around them, but they didn't have a word for. And it told them things they could do to resist it. And that's becoming more and more obvious to people that we really are living in a kind of totalitarianism, and that we had better be aware of it, because it's not totalitarianism like they had in the Soviet Union. That's hard totalitarianism. This is much more insidious, and it's coming on in the form of compassion, of safety, but it's still totalitarian. And I think this new book, didn't set out to write a trilogy, but the new book is not about the political, but about the purely spiritual and the numinous. And what it's doing is trying to get to the very heart of what it means to be a faithful Christian in this post-Christian, very materialist, very technological world. That if we lose this connection to the direct perception of the divine, of God and a Holy Spirit, then we will ultimately lose our faith. Marshall McLuhan, I quote him in the book, the great Canadian media theorist, who is also a church-going Catholic. He went to daily mass. He said that, he had these two concepts, percept and concept. A percept is something that you perceive directly. Concept is something like an idea that you make out of the percept. We have to have both to live in the world. But once religion ceases to be percept, the direct perception of God, usually in prayer, and becomes only concept, only propositions and ideas, then it begins to die. What I'm trying to do with this book, with Living in Wonder, is to bring people more back to the percept side, to make them to realize that this is normal, to have the perception of God, to participate in the life of God and the divine, is not only living in truth, but it's necessary to have any kind of flourishing faith, especially in a time when there are so many false forms of enchantment all around us, from the occult to things like high technology with AI, artificial intelligence.
Well, yeah, and something that comes out, I think, in the book is how persecution, historically, even with the early church, can elicit some of these, can elicit some of these reactions that point people towards enchantment, Christian enchantment in one direction or the other. And so I wanted to ask you about the politics of some of this. How does a world that's re-enchanting, partially because there's a darkening in Western culture, because there's a disenchantment in Western culture, how does the re-enchantment, we sort of know how the disenchantment has shaped our politics. You read a little bit about transgenderism in the book. You do cover that. There are obvious, political questions that linger over all of this about religious freedom, about LGBTQ issues, about abortion. So how does the re-enchantment then, in some ways, a reactment to the disenchantment, How do you think it will, how is it shaping politics right now?
Well, there's a new piece out in the New Yorker by Emma Green, who's just a wonderful correspondent in American religion. And she's talking about how the pro-life movement is readjusting to the post-Dobbs era. And they're seeking out more holistic ways of living and ways that politics can play a role in giving families more resources and building a society where families can flourish. There's something of all people, Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, where I live, he said something really profound, I think, a few years ago. He said, as a politician, I can't give you meaning. All I can do is give you things, by which he meant resources, financial resources, and passing laws that can improve people's material conditions. And by that, he also meant making it possible for those institutions that do give meaning, like churches, first among all, churches, schools, families, things like that, arts organizations, to give them a greater freedom to flourish and do their work. But he said, if these institutions do not step up and act in the freedom that politics provides for them, then anything political that we do to improve people's lives is not going to work. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind as we go forward into this new political era unfolding in the United States, is that for conservatives, this might be a great time, but it's not a time to rest on our laurels and just be happy that our side has political power. They have to use that power to make it possible for the meaning-giving institutions to flourish. Ultimately, though, it comes down to each and every one of us. How are we going to respond to this time? Are we going to simply be happy with getting our retirement accounts in place and making sure our kids get into the right school and go off to lead a life that may be materially prosperous but ultimately empty? Enchantment, in the sense of feeling this deep sense of life-changing unity with God and with His will for our lives. And that has got to be a will to serve Him and to serve those around us who He's given us to serve. That is what a meaningful life is. Without that, nothing we do in terms of improving the economy, in terms of legislation, is going to amount to anything. Finally, I should say that enchantment, in the sense I mean, gives meaning to life and helps us understand that the suffering that we all have to go through has ultimate meaning. I quote in the book Viktor Frankl, the Jewish, Austrian Jewish psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust. He talks about how people who have a reason to suffer can suffer anything. If you believe, as Christianity teaches, that everyone is going to have to suffer at some point, but if you unite your suffering to Christ in some way, your suffering will have meaning and then become bearable. It will be redemptive. I believe that with all my heart. If I didn't, I would not have been able to get through the things that I'm going through in my life, divorce and things like that. So I don't want people to get the idea that enchantment is suddenly, it takes care of all your problems. Not at all. You're still going to have those problems, but you see them in a different way, and you will connect to a real power, the power of God, that will give you the strength and the wisdom and the vision to overcome it and endure it and make something good and beautiful and redemptive out of it.
Lastly, Rod, someone who's definitely going to read this book, or maybe already has, is your friend J.D. Vance, who obviously is now Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. And his book, Hillbilly Elegy, was, it was released, and then when it really struck like wildfire in the Beltway was when you did an interview about the book with J.D. Vance at the time in the American Conservative, and I know you guys have become friends since. So I just wanted to ask, as we're talking about the politics of this big question, personally, what it's been like to watch J.D. Vance go from kind of Silicon Valley adjacent author in Ohio to vice president-elect and somebody who is now a leader in the conservative movement, and then B, how you think, if you have any insight into how JD is grappling with some of this as well.
Yeah. JD is impossible to get in touch with these days because he's drinking from a fire hose. We've had a few little signal exchanges since his election, but I don't expect to hear from him because he's got too much on his plate. But I got to tell you, it has been just a delight. I've had tears in my eyes more than once thinking about what's happened to him and this little boy who saw things that nobody should ever have to see growing up in his broken family. But he persevered. He overcame through the love and devotion of his mama, as broken as she herself was. It comes out in the book. But through his own perseverance, through the charity and care of others, through the U.S. Marine Corps, through the love of Usha, who helped him get through Yale Law School. And look where he is now. JD is a deeply good man. I believe that and knew that from personal experience before he even thought about politics. And when he was starting to think about politics, that's when he also, for whatever reason, started to feel drawn to a formal commitment to God, to Jesus Christ, as a Catholic. I'm not a Catholic myself, but I introduced him to the young man who was his first instructor in the Catholic faith, a Dominican there in Washington. He finished his instruction in Ohio, and he invited me to be one of a handful of his friends who was there when he formally committed himself to Christ as a Catholic. And I think the reason he did that was not only from a desire for God, to know God in a deeper way, but I think he also saw a future for himself in public service. And there was something about the Catholic intellectual tradition, especially Catholic social teaching, that he sensed would give him a deep grounding in how to think about the Christian faith in a way that would enable him to be a political leader and to lead in public policy in a way to improve people's lives and to, well, it sounds kind of cheesy to say, to spread goodness on the earth, but that's how it is, because he knows how hard he had it. He knows how much the government can do to help people, but he also knows how little the government can do, which is one of the things that I love about his book, is he talks openly in the book about how much personal moral agency matters and strong families matter. So I tell you, I could not be happier with what's happened. And I really do believe that, God willing, this next term for Donald Trump will be seen by future historians as a prelude to the J.D. Vance era of American politics.
And that is to say, finally, that J.D. Vance is serious about his faith, that it's not some people will say it was a cynical maneuver for him to become a new right champion. But no, this is a deeply held belief system, right, Rod?
No, it really is. I mean, he really does believe it. And I think, too, and he said this, but I know it's not cynical, that everything that happened during President Trump's first term helped radicalize JD, in particular what happened to Brett Kavanaugh, his personal friend, the way the left tried to destroy Kavanaugh. And I think all of these things made JD have a deep rethink of his presuppositions about American politics and American life and where the enemies were. He began to see that, for all of his flaws, Donald Trump is right about some very big things about the way the elites affect American life. And that caused a political conversion for J.D. Vance. I don't think it was cynical one bit, because I myself have gone through a similar conversion about Donald Trump. I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, but I was certainly a supporter of his, because I think he is the last political hope we have to try to turn things around. And when he chose J.D. Vance, I took that as a real sign that maybe it's okay now to have hope in politics again. Not ultimate hope, because for the reasons we were talking earlier, politics aren't going to save us. But maybe they can do some good and not be only destructive or at best ineffective.
Rod Dreher, this book is so wonderful, to borrow a word from the title. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks so much.
Okay, so you may have been able to tell, but I was really excited about this interview because I'm a paid subscriber to Rod's Substack, which I read every day, because he has a knack for finding some of the craziest but also most salient stories that are relevant to politics, that are relevant to media, and he's definitely not afraid to come in with, as we just talked about, that weird perspective, not the Western educated industrial democratic weird, but the weird as in Benedict option, weird perspective on the daily happenings of the day, something that is totally against the pop cultural grain. So I was really excited actually to talk to him about this book, and I could have kept going for another half hour. I had a lot of questions, but I didn't want to keep Rod too long with me just pinging him with all all of my personal curiosities. It was so helpful, though, to get to the bottom of big questions about the themes of living in wonder and re-enchantment, which, again, if you're not super tuned into some of these conversations that we've hosted with Alex O'Connor on New Atheism and Spencer Clavin on science and faith, just for the last month, we've had both of them on the program to talk through some of this. And if you're not someone who follows that discourse every single day, first of all, good for you. That sounds nice because it gets dark and heavy sometimes, but it is just I think it's a really helpful way to understand how thinkers on the right are understanding the world themselves, because this is what people are reading and talking about at the conferences and in the Substack newsletters and in the sort of online discourse, the very online discourse, capital V, capital O. So it may sound esoteric, it may sound obscure, but I actually think what we just talked about with Rod is going to be one of the driving forces on the right, period, on the political right, period, on the cultural right, period, over the next decade. So it was great to talk to him. Thank you for tuning in. Please make sure to subscribe here on the Undercurrents channel. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, to the full premium experience of the show over at undercurrents.tv. We'll be back with more soon.